The challenges to building a biblical worldview in our students are real, and they're internal and external. Externally, every one of us brings into the institution our own flesh, the Bible's description of what it means to have a sinful nature. We're naturally resistant to a biblical worldview because the flesh only sees, feels, hears, tastes, touches, only experiences reality in the here and now. It has no long-term view, but the biblical worldview is eternal in nature. When all this flesh gets together, individuals joining together in cultures, societies, and nations, we get what the Bible calls a world, the institutionalized resistance against God's way of doing things. As if that's not enough, on the supernatural side of the universe, there's a supervisor overseeing the unholy alliance between the world and the flesh. The devil is called the god of this world. He's like the dean of World University, generating courses that appeal to the flesh. These three challenges make it difficult for any institution to develop a biblical worldview in their students. As if that's not enough, there are many internal challenges as well. Our own ignorance. Ignorance is not sinful, but it's real, and it's something we need to overcome. Ignorance is not the problem, our sinful rebellion is, but ignorance is real. How do we do biblical integration? Time. Teachers are strapped for time. Schools, by nature, have a rigorous pace. How do we find the time to do biblical integration? It seems like just an extra thing to do, something to add into an already difficult to manage schedule. Students, as they get older, sometimes get tired of hearing the Bible. They use phrases like, "Stop pushing it down our throats." This is something we must deal sensitively with and examine our own teaching, lifestyle, and interaction habits to see what it is that's causing this. Is it a natural resistance from students who haven't accepted the gospel, or are we contributing to it by our insensitivity? Our own teaching habits can work against biblical integration. Perhaps like me, you come from a 1st through 12th grade secular education where even praying was a very foreign habit. Even though I've worked in a school now for 15 years, a Christian school, it's still awkward for me to pray in front of students. How awkward it may be for many of us who are just not used to thinking in biblical perspective terms when we plan our lessons. And biblical integration itself is sort of a complex intellectual skill where we try to show how the various pieces of our subject puzzle fit in the big picture of a biblical worldview. But there's so many ways to do it incorrectly, it's easy to become confused. The challenges are real, but I believe it's worth it to continue on. I used to show my middle school students this visual, showing them that even if they weren't believers, there were still good reasons to understand a biblical worldview. Let me highlight just a few. The Bible, for example, says that children who obey their parents live longer. I live in a nation where there are cobras, dogs with rabies, strangers, streets with no sidewalks, and busy traffic. You better believe that my children are living longer because they're learning to obey me. That's just one example of a biblical mandate that grants us safety. Western culture is mostly shaped by the biblical worldview. That is not to justify everything Western culture or Western nations do, but if you want a significant understanding of the world's history, then understand a biblical worldview which has had influence on Western cultures and leaders. Conflict of every shape and size is partly a product, or at least influenced, and our responses to conflict are influenced by the way we see the world. These are just a few of the reasons I tell students, even students from other faith backgrounds, that it's worth their while understanding a biblical perspective. But for those of us who are Christian teachers, we have an even greater reason. I like to consider the understanding of a biblical worldview a kind of pre-evangelism, where we are breaking up ground in order to help students understand a biblical worldview, because the biblical worldview is the context in which the gospel makes sense. With that in mind, our ministry may be more like John the Baptist, calling people in order to prepare them to understand a greater one to come. Let me illustrate this from the missionary journeys of Paul. In Acts 17, we see 3 stops on his journey. And on the 3rd stop, something interesting happens. Let's look at the first 2 to draw the contrast. In Thessalonica, Paul followed his usual pattern of going into the synagogue and preaching. And according to the usual pattern, he gained followers and believers pretty soon. His next stop was in Berea, where he followed the same pattern, going into the synagogue, preaching the gospel, and gaining believers. On his 3rd stop, he goes to Athens, and while he follows his normal pattern and goes to the synagogue, he also speaks in the marketplace. And here something interesting happens. He's called a babbler. He's accused of advocating foreign gods. That's pretty sharp accusation for a city that prided itself in having hundreds of gods already. Yet when Paul talked about the resurrection, there was a total disconnect, and those in the city of Athens, who were familiar with so many religions, couldn't make sense of it. So they invited him to come to the place that hosted all their talk shows. And while they were there, Paul tried a different take. He backed up, and instead of immediately jumping into Scripture or resurrection or the Jesus story, he begins with creation, and he sets the framework for a biblical worldview. Only after doing that does he then begin to talk about the resurrection. And then he began to gain some followers, people who wanted to learn more, because the background of a biblical worldview helped the gospel itself make sense. So I'd like to put this in the framework of what we do in a Christian school. There's a lot that goes on besides just teaching in the classroom. Let me see if I can give a sense of purpose to each one, excuse me, so that we can see where we fit. By our lifestyle, whether as teachers, office workers, administrators, support staff, whatever, we make Christ attractive because our God is a personal God. By our outreach events, which are voluntary for students to attend, that's where we make the gospel and Christ available. That's where we give the strongest invitations, because our God is an open door to his kingdom. In our regular chapels, we make Christ challenging. Sometimes that's a direct gospel confrontation and invitation. More often, they're character or social issues. But in the classroom, through the giving of a biblical worldview, we demonstrate that Christ is reasonable, that the gospel is not just a means of getting us into heaven, but of bringing heaven to earth in all of earth's endeavors, in all the academic subjects, in all the fields of interest. Because if God created this world and all the laws that govern it, including social interaction, then God has a lot to say and a lot to do with everything we do in this world.